Okay, so before we start coding, guys, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Model View Controller framework is, how it relates to our project, what we've done so far in our code, and what we're going to be doing moving forward in this video. So let's talk about what exactly this diagram means and what it represents. So this solid line here means owns, this dotted line here means talks to. So we can see that our controller owns our model and it owns our view, and that the controller and the model both talk to each other, and that the controller and the view both talk to each other. But the model and the view never talk directly to one another except through the controller. So let's go over exactly what all of this means in our completed project here. So this screen you see in front of you is our Pokedex controller. So that's our view controller right here. Okay. And it's populated with a bunch of Pokemon. So our Pokemon is our model. If you guys remember in our last video, we created that Pokemon class, and it contained all the attributes that we need to construct each one of our Pokemon programmatically, right? And then each one of these cells is our view, which is this Pokedex cell that you see here. So that just contains an image and a name. Well, it actually contains a Pokemon, and then we populate that cell with the Pokemon's image and name. So let's talk about the relationship here. So the controller owns an instance of our model, right? So the controller owns an array of Pokemon, okay? So the controller also owns our view, which is our collection view that we see here, each one of these cells. So we populate each one of these cells with a Pokemon, but we do that through the controller. So the controller goes and talks to the model and says, hey, I need all the Pokemon that I need to populate the view with. The model gives the controller back all those Pokemon, and then the controller goes ahead and updates the view and then gives us what we see in front of us here. So that's a quick explanation on the relationship. Let's go over what we've done now in our code. So we've created our model, which is our Pokemon class here, right? And we have also created our view, which is our Pokedex cell, and then we've created our controller. So we have fetched our data from our API and constructed all of our Pokemon, right? That's what we did in our service class when we fetched all this data with this fetch Pokemon function, and this is where we constructed our Pokemon, right? So now what we need to do moving forward is set up our code so that our controller can have access to that array of Pokemon, right? Because remember, if we look at the diagram, our controller owns an instance of our model. And then we're going to use that array of Pokemon to update our view. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video, guys. I hope you're excited. I hope that explanation makes sense. It's a pretty simple framework once you get the hang of it, and we have done a very good job of implementing it so far. So let's go ahead and get started with the code now. Okay, guys, so let's jump into our Pokedex controller. And what we want to do right now is set up our code so that our controller owns an instance of this model. So it's going to be pretty simple. All we need to do is go under our properties section and go ahead and say var Pokemon equals an array of Pokemon, right? So this is that custom object we created. And if you guys remember, we want to create or populate this array of Pokemon so that we can populate our collection view using that array, right? So let's go ahead and make a change really quick. Hop down to your collection view extension and the number of items in section function here, okay? So here we're going to now return Pokemon.count instead of returning 6, right? Because we want our collection view to return the number of items that exist within this array. In this case, it should be 151, which is the amount of Pokemon that we have, right? So what we need to do now is actually populate this array, because right now it's empty. So that's how we are going to set up our controller and model talking to one another. So now the controller owns an instance of the model. Now we need to have the model give the controller back these Pokemon, right? So hop into our service function, because this is where we fetch our Pokemon, right? And if you guys remember, this is where we configure our Pokemon or set them up, okay? So we're going to do this through creating a completion block. And I'm going to explain exactly what that means once we're done. But for now, let's go ahead and type this out. So go into the parentheses of your fetch Pokemon function and say completion, colon, and then at escaping, and then do parentheses like this, And then inside of this first set of parentheses, we're going to make this an array of Pokemon, right? So that's all we're going to do there. And you can go ahead and delete this line of code here, print Pokemon.name. And here we are going to say, actually, before we do that, we need to create this array of Pokemon. So we're going to say var Pokemon equals an array, or let's call this Pokemon array for now, equals an empty array of Pokemon. So now this is where we get each one of our individual Pokemon after we fetched our data from our API. So now what we need to do is, because this is inside a for loop, if we remember, we need to add each one of these Pokemon that we create to this array up here, right? So let's say Pokemon array dot append Pokemon. So now after that for loop is completed, we want to call our completion block and say, hey, okay, now that this array is done being populated, then we can say this function is done. And we're going to see why that's useful in a little bit. So for now, just go outside of that dictionary guy and say completion Pokemon array, okay? So don't worry about this stuff right now, guys. I'm going to come back to it and I'm going to explain it. Let's just hop back into our Pokedex controller, and we want to update this function now. So go ahead and just delete that and say dot fetch. Oops. So we actually need to build our project first because it's not recognizing that that was updated. So now go here and say service.share.fetch Pokemon. And now it's going to contain this completion block here, right? So what we can do is hit enter on that completion block and say Pokemon. And then we are going to say self.Pokemon equals Pokemon, okay? So let's go over what exactly we just did, right? So we went back into our service and we created this completion block, right? So essentially what a completion block does is we can, and we added in this array of Pokemon sort of parameter here, right? So when you implement a completion block, it allows you to say when your function is done. And in this case, we are going to say our function is done and pass in this array of Pokemon. So after this API call is complete, and all of these Pokemon have been added to this array that we created, then we say, okay, completion Pokemon array, meaning this function is done, that Pokemon array is fully populated. So, and when we call this completion or this function, we have access to this Pokemon array. So let's go back into our controller, and we notice that we have this Pokemon guy here when we pressed enter on our completion block, right? So essentially what this is saying is that once that function is fully completed, its execution, right? So what we talked about before when we said, okay, that Pokemon array is fully updated and our API call is complete, then we have access to that Pokemon array through this guy here. And then we say self.Pokemon, or this guy here, is then equal to that array of Pokemon. So that is how we update our array of Pokemon, right? And we want to use a completion block because we want to make sure that our API call has successfully completed before we put information into that array, right? Because say that API call didn't complete and we tried to update our collection view, it wouldn't update, or our app could potentially crash because you are trying to update a collection view with an empty array, or it could be empty. It could cause a multitude of problems. So that's why we implement a completion block there, right? So we've successfully populated our controller with an instance of our model now, right? So that part's done. Now what we need to do is set up our view, right? So let's go down here, and we wanted to return our Pokemon.count, right? So actually, we need to say self.collectionView.reload data. So once that array is finished populating, then it's going to reload our collection view, right? And give us back the amount of elements that are in that that we want it to have. So let's go ahead and run this code and see if this is working. That needs to be, okay, so we get a little error here. Must be used from main thread only, right? So that's pretty easy to fix. All we need to do is go here, cut this code, and say dispatch queue dot main dot async, and then paste that in there. So that error we got back was saying that we need to reload our collection view on our main thread, right? I'm not going to get into what that means too much because it can be kind of complicated, but essentially, or it's a whole nother topic of discussion, but just write this code out and that's what we need to do there. So let's go ahead and run this again and see what happens. So we noticed that this populates nicely, and if you guys wanted to go ahead and count all these out individually, you could, but let's just go ahead and say that there's 151 in there because I'm sure that's what it is, right? So that we have successfully now populated this Pokemon array and returned the correct amount of cells. So we know that our Pokemon array is configured properly and we're getting back the number of cells that we need. Now we need to actually set up this cell with the information for each Pokemon. So we are going to hop into our Pokedex cell and we are going to create an instance of our model. So we're going to say var Pokemon, which is of type Pokemon, and make it optional and say did set. So now this is going to be pretty cool, guys. So if you remember from our diagram, you guys might be going, well, what the heck is going on? You said the model and the view never talk directly to each other. Well, just because this contains an instance of our model, that doesn't mean that they're talking to each other directly. It all depends on how we set this Pokemon in this class, right? And we're going to do that through the use of our controller. We're not going to do it from our model. So let's go back into our Pokedex controller, and this is the trick that we are going to do. So go ahead and delete this line of code. And this is where we define each one of our cells in our collection view, right? So we're going to say cell.pokemon equals Pokemon index path dot row. Okay? And essentially what this is doing is it's going into this Pokemon array and it's saying, okay, look at the 0 index, right? So when we are at cell 0, I want you to go into the array of Pokemon that you have here and get me the 0 element of that array, which in this case is Bulbasaur. And then it's going to say, okay, the 0 cell or the first cell, the Pokemon for that cell is going to be whatever Pokemon, the first Pokemon that exists in that Pokemon array, right? So that's what that's doing there. That's what this index path.row is. Essentially, it's saying for every cell, give me the 0 Pokemon, the 1 Pokemon, the 2 Pokemon. And then it's updating the corresponding cell 0, 1, 2 with each one of those Pokemon, right? We need to say index path.row, or item is better because this is a collection view. So now we need to actually set up the attributes for this Pokemon. So it needs an image and it needs a name, right? So for now, we don't have the image, but we are going to get the name. So we're going to say let's see, name label. So this is going to be what we do. Name label dot text equals Pokemon dot name. Okay. And now if we run our code, I'll explain this did set guy here in just a second as well. So this is looking super good, guys. It's giving us back the names of all of our Pokemon in each one of these cells. So this is coming together really nicely. To get our image, because those images are located on the internet, we actually have to make another API call in order to download those images. So all we have is an image URL. So if we were to go into this guy here, let's go here, or just go into Firebase because it's easier to read the data here. So I think you guys might remember when I did this, here's our image URL. So this is the location of each one of the Pokemon images on the internet. So if we pasted this URL here, we get back the image for our Pokemon. So what we're going to be doing now is actually making another API call to get this image, downloading that image, and then setting that image in our Pokemon cell. So let's go ahead and get started with what we need to do there, guys. So before we move forward, guys, I want to talk about what this did set does. So essentially we have a Pokemon variable in each one of our Pokedex cells, right? And then that Pokemon variable is being set from our controller, which conforms to our model view controller framework. The controller owns the model and then updates the view with that model. So if we go into our Pokedex controller, we see just that. This is where we are setting that Pokemon. So once that Pokemon gets set, right, that did set method executes and then will execute the code that we put in this closure here. Okay, so the only other thing we need to do is add in our Pokemon image, right? So we want to say image view.image equals Pokemon that needs to be optional .image. So this image value right now is nil. If you guys remember, we have this image in our Pokemon class, but we haven't set that yet. We only have access to the image URL. So we're going to hop back into our service and write a function to go ahead and fetch that image and then set it in our Pokemon class so that we can update it in our Pokemon cells. So first thing is we need to import UI kit, okay? Because we are going to be working with UI image, okay? So go here and we're going to create a private function called fetch image. And it's going to take in a URL string. And then, yeah, let's call this URL string. Let's say with URL string. And then this is going to be a type string. And then we are going to implement another completion block here. So do this at escaping and we want it to escape with a UI image. So I forgot to explain what this escaping means, guys. So I'll do that really quickly once we finish typing out the code for this function. So what we want to do is we need to first convert this URL string into a URL. So let's say guard let URL equal URL from string and pass in that URL string that we have in our parameter and then say else return. So then, just like with our Pokemon, now we need to begin this data task, right? So we're going to say URL session.shared.data task and select this option with URL and completion handler, okay? And then pass in the URL we just created and then hit enter on that block. And we're going to do the same thing, data response error. And the first thing we want to do is handle our error. So we can actually just go back up here, copy and paste this, and just change the message. So failed to fetch image with error. And now what we need to do is get our data, right? So we're going to say guard let data equals data else return, because that data guy is optional. So we want to make sure we safely unwrap it there. So this is really simple to do, guys, to create this image. We're going to say guard let image equal UI image. And we can pass in this data parameter, and Swift actually converts that data that we get back into a UI image, which is really cool and really convenient. So now let's handle our completion. So we just go ahead down here and say completion image, right? And before we move forward, we need to remember to implement our .resume, and we're good to go. So that's all we need to do to fetch this image, guys. And we make it private because we only want it accessible through this class, which we're going to see where we call this function here, right? So let's go inside of this for loop. And essentially, we're going to access our Pokemon image URL, which is a property associated with our Pokemon, call this function within that for loop for each one, and then set our Pokemon's image. And then we're going to go forward from there. So let's go ahead and go right underneath let Pokemon, and then we're going to say guard let image URL equal Pokemon image URL else return. And then just go down here and we're going to call that function. And because we're in a closure, we need to say self. So let's say self.fetch image with that image URL. And then hit enter on our completion block, and then we have access to that image here. So really quick, going back to this escaping allows us to access this UI image guy within this completion block. So it essentially says, okay, this UI image can escape from this completion block here, and we can use that image in our code. All right, guys, so now we're gonna just say Pokemon.image equals image. So we are setting the image for this Pokemon using this image here. And then we wanna just copy that there, and also this completion block here, or this completion statement. So let's go ahead and clean this up, run our code, and we should see our code working nicely. So once you guys have that, let me see why this is formatted so weirdly. Okay, that looks good. So now go ahead and run your code, and you should see all of those Pokemon images coming up nicely. Okay, so this is looking really good. But for some of you guys, you might notice that all of these Pokemon are sort of out of order, and that's because this stuff is being fetched in a fashion that is asynchronous, meaning it's not done in order of how our data is structured. And that's because some data or files are larger than others, so it basically fetches it in a convenience fashion. So what we want to do is just hop back into this function, and to ensure that we get all of our Pokemon back in order, we're going to sort this array. So it's going to look like this. Go underneath your Pokemon array.append Pokemon statement or line of code, and just say Pokemon array.sort by, and then hit enter on that, and just say Poke1 and Poke2. And then we are just going to say return Poke1.id is less than Poke2.id. And I think we're going to get an error here. Yeah, so these can't be optional. So we need to force unwrap these. And that's okay, because at this point we know that we have a Pokemon, so it's okay to force unwrap them. Like if we weren't to get our Pokemon back, it would have stopped at this line of code here, so our code isn't going to crash. And you can leave this completion statement outside of this sort function. Go ahead and run our code again. And this way we guarantee that our Pokemon will always be sorted in the correct order. So that's looking really good, guys. We have successfully populated each one of our cells with a custom Pokemon object. And we also reached out to the internet, downloaded the images for each one of our Pokemon using that image URL property, and then set that image for each one of our custom Pokemon objects. So this is a lot of really cool stuff, working with object-oriented programming, working with API fetches, and we have also successfully implemented the Model View Controller framework. So you guys are doing awesome so far, super proud of you, and we're gonna be moving on with implementing this long press functionality to get this cool custom animation and this cool like pop-up window showing up. And we're gonna be populating that with some information about our Pokemon as well. You guys can go ahead and stop the video here if you want. I'm gonna do a quick explanation of everything that we did in this video, just as a nice little recap. And if you guys are stopping here, make sure you hit subscribe. I hope you like the content. Leave me some feedback in the comments and help me grow this channel. So let's start back with our diagram, guys. So we have our model, which is our Pokemon. We have our controller, Pokedex controller, and our view, which is our Pokedex cell. So what we did to start was we went to our Pokedex controller and created an instance of that model. So that meets this requirement here. Our controller now owns our model, right? And these two guys talk to each other. So we had our model set up all of our Pokemon, and then through the use of our API, we set up that Pokemon array through this function here. So we set up all our Pokemon here, and we had to call on our model to do that, which is what we did here. And then once they were all set up, we implemented some completion blocks to make sure that those API calls had successfully completed before we move forward. That's super important when working with calls to the internet, because that stuff takes time to complete, right? So we implemented those completion blocks, set up our model, and then handed that information back to our controller, right? So that's what we did in this function here, okay? And we reloaded our collection view on the main thread because that's a requirement. And then what we did was we set our Pokemon in each one of our cells, right? So it might be a little confusing, to have this Pokemon variable in this Pokemon view class, but remember that it's okay as long as the Pokemon is being configured by our controller, which is what we did in this did set method, right? So we have our Pokedex controller, and then we set that Pokemon in our Pokedex controller, which is satisfies the requirements for this relationship as well. So we have successfully implemented this MVC framework, and the project is going really well, guys. I hope you're liking the content, and like I said in the next video, we're going to be moving on to some more interesting functionality. So we're almost done, and I hope you guys are liking this so far. We'll see you in the next one. Peace out.